Okay, today we're going to talk about land, water, and air rights. Some of the things in the press today that we hear about right now, more than anything, talk about our water rights. When we have unprecedented dry spells, we are concerned about water and who and how do we get access to that water, who has first rights to that water. When we look at California, Nevada, what happens with water, how do we get it to them, and who has the right to have it. Other things that concern us with land, water, and air rights might be flooding. When we talk about natural disasters, whose responsibility is it to clean up, number one, but then we have the after effect of that natural disaster, and what happens with FEMA, and requirements to be able to build there again, and what happens if your land is taken as a result of those kind of issues. All of these things are newsworthy articles that are happening today that we can think about, again, our land, water, and air rights. So land, obviously, it's the solid surface of the earth and the natural elements, the water and minerals associated with it. So think about that. Basically, when we own a piece of land, we really own all the way to the core of the earth. How far down is that? We don't really know for sure, but how do we get the minerals or everything underneath the dirt available to us? Again, land actually is layers, and we can lease and sell the rights to the minerals and things under the land separately from the surface of the land. When we look at the real estate, we look at the land and its improvements, the mines, the minerals, quarries under the land, the air and water rights associated with the land, and the other rights and privileges related to the land. So again, that big, larger 10,000 foot looking down, what all is in that land? What all makes up that land? And is just a piece of land? Does it have a stream that runs through it, or a river runs by it, or ocean along it, a lake, things like that, that we're going to think about with the riparian or the littoral rights. And then ultimately we need to look at land as a natural resource. There is only a limited amount of land, and whether we like to think about it or not, land is actually decreasing. We're losing surface of the land to erosion from the sea and the oceans and lakes. Everything is actually decreasing the amount of land that we have. And so it's ever changing, ever moving. Water, the surface water. Water upon the surface of the earth and flowing streams and lakes. So we talk about riparian lands, or those that border on a stream or a water course. So think about riparian R being the river. Littoral lands are those that border on an ocean, sea, or lake. So again, the littoral versus riparian littoral, think about that as the lake. Very often, though, when we talk about water, we really are just talking about water. And for real estate people, we need to have some distinguishing factor, whether it's riparian or littoral, and understand how those rights come about. So that's part of what this lesson is going to be. We'll talk about the history of water rights. So the riparian, the water rights theory, is the riparianism of the eastern states. Water rights doctrine is based on the idea that all owners of riparian lands are entitled to share equally in the use of water. So they have a natural flow doctrine and reasonable use doctrines that come across this. So if you live on that piece of land that's right next to the river, obviously you can pull the river water and use it for irrigation, for your crops, or for your animals. But the reasonable use and the natural flow is you have to allow it to flow naturally across your land to the neighboring properties. And reasonable use is that you're not going to be the hog. You're not going to take it all. You're not going to leave any water unavailable for other users to benefit from. So when we look at canals and we look at like a water mill or a grist mill that runs off of the water to make the wheel flow, they're borrowing the water for a moment while the water runs that wheel, but that water continues to offload and continues to be part of that stream or that canal. So they're really not taking it away. That's a reasonable use for a short period of time, but they're always replenishing. It's getting put back. There's a little bit of takeaway, but it's a reasonable use in how it's done. The prior appropriation theory is what we talk about Western states, where water rights doctrine gives primary rights to the first users of the water, and they have the beneficial use. So think about out west, as the west was settled and wagon trains were going out west and everything. A farmer came across a stream, and that was probably where he wanted to locate his property, so that he could have easy access to water, to be able to live and use it for cooking and for getting the water to his animals and crops. But he might have had the first right. He made the first application to use it because he was the first settler there. But when little towns and things were settled, and if the town wasn't right on the water's edge, but the town needed water, and they couldn't dig for water through a well system, but they were able to put piping in or get water transferred to them, they might have been the first uh, user applicant for that water, and therefore they became the primary user. So it's like a licensing system. They're filing paperwork to be able to have the right to have that water, and it isn't necessarily based on how they're geographically located next to the water. So that's primarily the difference between the two. Riparianism used to be geographically located, whereas the prior appropriation was that you just happen to file paperwork to get to it. And the beneficial use, what is more beneficial? What's more needs? Do we have industry? Do we have agricultural? Do we have the use for people, for potable water, for our water for our domestic use? That's going to be how they prioritize how this prior appropriation works. The statutory permit system requires that a person seeking to obtain unappropriated water file an application for the permit with the state agency. So they have the necessary information to determine whether granting the permit is in the public interest. So again, are they doing good? Are they doing manufacturing? Are they doing agricultural use? Is it for domestic use? Is it because they're building a small city and they're going to have to put water conditioning systems in to supply water to the residents for use, for industrial, for domestic use, things like that. So this necessary information is determining whether it is public interest and how will it be used and what's the waste effect. When the water gets shut off, when they're done using it, where's that water going to go? And what condition is it in? Does it get returned back to the stream in a decent condition so it can continue to be reused, or does it have to be treated at some point in time? That's all this permitting process, the things that they're looking at with the water. Subterranean water, important source of water for which methods of obtaining have improved. Obviously, we have better equipment to drill today. We know what's under the water, under the land. We can see better through radar systems and things like that. We can see what's under the land. So we have percolating waters. They're waters that pass through the ground, not flowing in a clearly defined underground stream or supplied by stream flowing on the surface, but we can tap into that percolating water. So we have rules about who gets it, how is it arrived at, and who gets the first priority. So we have things called the common law rule, the reasonable use rule, and then correlative rights doctrines that all go with how can we tap into the groundwater, use it, and have the right to use groundwater. And when we tap, do we go straight down? Can we go over into somebody else's property? How do you determine when you're crossing that kind of thing? Again, these are all part of these rules about how we can tap into it. And when we look at subterranean water, we're also looking at a situation today like with fracking to get natural gas. They're using water to pump into the ground to pull the natural gas out. And how does that cross? You know, when you've got this boundary line for a piece of land, you can see it on the surface, but you can't necessarily see underground what's tapping into it, how is it done. So all these rules are how do we figure who has the real rights to get to it. Underground streams are subterranean waters that flow in a clearly defined channel, discoverable from the Earth's surface, because we can see where it starts and stops, because it did start at some point in time. And sometimes it might be a cave or something where we can see where it started and stopped, but that's how we can determine where it flows from and who has rights to it. Navigable waters. Waters that provide a channel for commerce and transportation are considered navigable waters and are under federal jurisdiction. So state of Ohio, the river, actually it's not even state of Ohio, the Ohio River actually in Cincinnati belongs to Kentucky. It's part of the Kentucky boundary, but there's federal jurisdiction that rules the waterways, how barges and commercial traffic can flow on that waterway, and how regular people can use it to fish, to have their boats for summer joy and things like that. What is all those laws and rules? Part of that is a federal issue, and the Ohio River is not just through Ohio. It runs from Pennsylvania through Virginia, into the Mississippi River and into the ocean eventually. So this navigable waterway becomes federally jurisdiction, and states control or rule and police it, but there are federal waterway laws as to how it's run. So what we look at for the determination of this is it's subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. Does it connect with continuous interstate waterways? Does it have a navigable capacity and is actually navigable? So one of the things we look at might be the Great Miami River or the Little Miami River. Are these navigable waterways? Yeah, they are. Are they commercially used today? Not necessarily, because you can't get a big boat through them. They were years ago. Historically, both of these riverways were used for commercial use to flow goods on canals and things. But who has the jurisdiction? Who rules it? And who's responsible for taking care of the river waterway, or when garbage gets deposited, who's responsible for cleaning it up? All of these things are issues that we're going to be looking at for the navigable waterways. Mineral rights. It's the right to extract minerals from under the land, which may be legally assigned to or owned by someone other than the surface owner. So they can legally own it through deeds, reservations, leases, or option rights. And again, we think about the surface of land and the sandwiches or layers underneath the land to get to these mineral rights. There's a lot of minerals that we can pull from the ground that are used in commerce today, for energy, for coal, different oil, things like that, and gas that we're pulling out of the ground. And when you own that surface, you own the rights to be able to do deeds, reservations, or leases to get profit off of that. Ownership of oil and gas. Oil and gas is interesting in the fact that it's not just contained the way a piece of coal might be. It's not a hard mineral. It flows. It ebbs. So we look at different ownership theories to talk about who owns it and who's entitled to it and who's entitled to profits off of it. So we have the ownership theory, which is the theory under which oil and gas are minerals and therefore is subject to absolute ownership as coal and any other solid mineral. Therefore, the people that own the land that it's found within are entitled to it under the ownership theory. We have the non-ownership theory that says that oil and gas are not the subject of ownership because they're migratory nature. So this whole thing about ownership and non-ownership theory all depends upon what state you're in. State laws govern whether it's ownership theory or non-ownership theory kind of state. And then we have something called rule of capture, which is the rule that states the owner of the surface has the right to appropriate all oil and gas from wells on his or her land, including oil and gas that have migrated from the land of another. So I put the well in. The well is on my property. The rig is on my property. Therefore, it's on my property. I own everything that it can get. Well, that's not quite the right way to look at it because we do have these other theories. So we're going to look at state statutes to govern who actually owns it, who has rights entitlement to it. And then we have the doctrine of correlative rights. We have spacing statutes, and then we have production control. These are all issues that are going to govern who has the right to collect the fees or the profit drilling underground to get to these oil and mineral rights. Fracking is the process of extracting oil or gas by injecting liquid at high pressure into subterranean rock and matter to force open existing fissures. There's a lot of pros about it. It's a huge method of getting gas today. It's part of the reason the U.S. can produce so much gas and, quote, at a lower rate. So it does reduce our dependence on oil and gas. It displaces the need for coal because coal is thought of to be a dirty type fuel source, whereas gas is cleaner. There's a decrease in cost of oil and gas as supply rises because we have more gas available, and produces an incentive for foreign investment in the U.S. plants, thus boosting the economy. So those are all the goods and pros about why we would want to frack. But you're hearing a lot of negativity about fracking today. It demands vast quantities of water and chemicals, and there's potential hazards to human health and environment. We don't even know what all these hazards are yet, because fracking hasn't been around for all that much time, and we're learning all the time about what taking this oil and gas from land can do to our health. Air rights, traditional theory, in the Ed Coleum doctrine, is being replaced as ownership of airspace has developed. Think about airspace. What are you entitled to as far as airspace? How high can you reach? How high does it go? What about solar farms today and wind farms? If you are trying to have a solar panel on your rooftop and somebody builds next to you but blocks the sun, is that an air right issue? If you have a windmill on your property, but a large building or something is built in front of that windmill to stop the wind from flowing on through that windmill the way it used to, those are air rights. Those are the issues we're going to be looking at when we talk about air rights. Traditionally now, air rights, though, anything that's above a certain point in time is controlled by the Federal Air Administration, because its air rights is to flying rights, and what can you do and how is that air rights controlled for the safety in general of the public. So that's controlled by the FAA. Another thing that's going on is people want to play with these little things called drones. And what right do you have to fly your drone around personal property? What right do you have to put a camera on that drone and take pictures of people as you're flying your drone around and you're gathering information? It's one thing to do information sourcing through a drone to learn about geology and things like that, but at what point does it become spying and violating somebody's personal rights when you're flying that drone around? These are all things about air rights that will come up in the future as we look to work with this technology. Common law limitations. Obviously a nuisance. An unreasonable interference by one party with another's use or enjoyment of his or her land would be considered a nuisance. Trespass. A wrongful physical invasion of the property of another, especially when you have signs that say no trespassing posted. Somebody comes into your property, that's a trespass. Managing shopping centers. I have to post trespass notices because my shopping center in general is a public place to be. We want to invite the public onto the property to shop at the shops. But at some point in time, we want to say, wait a minute, you're subject to being toted off the property or issued a no trespass. If we think you're being a nuisance, if we think you're violating rights, if we think there's a threat of something that you're doing, your truck is parked on our property exceedingly long period of time. Our parking lots aren't meant for trucks. They're not built to handle the truck traffic. So we might want to say and issue you a trespass to say don't come onto our property again. We have premises liability. Owners and occupiers of land may be liable to visitors. Obviously we are, especially in a commercial area where we invite people onto our property. We're liable to those visitors. So we want to control who the visitors are and how they come onto our property. So that's part of this common law limitation. It's kind of that joke when somebody breaks into your house, you shoot them in the front but not in their back, because if you shoot them in the back, they're fleeing, and therefore they're no longer, quote, a threat. So again, this premises liability. So that's really what we need to do with this chapter.